I think what we should start with is what we already knew before we came to this report. What we already knew was that cuts were going in spending overall were going to be quite modest. Nominal spending would rise, real spending would fall by around 4%, and as a share of GDP, spending would fall back to roughly where it was in 2006-07. What that conceals and what leads to a lot of the tough decisions which have been made in the spending review is a major redistribution of spending, which is the major thing that's going on here, a major shift in spending towards, firstly, debt interest. I think the key political implication of what my conservative talks about in debt interest is that you have an argument between people who are advocating cuts and people who are advocating cutting less. Those who advocate cutting less would see more debt, ergo more debt interest, ergo more cuts further down the line. If these cuts are being driven by paying for debt interest we've already racked up, then slowing that process, unless we think there's some Keynesian miracle here, is leading. The unions are arguing for more cuts. They're just arguing for putting them off, putting those cuts back for it, and that can make them larger. That can make them more severe. And I think that is the leaving aside the risks around things like gilt rates. That's a real consequence that we face had that debt, whether that not the growth of that debt not arrested. The second point is, of course, the ring fences, both the different levels of ring fence. International development has a perfect ring fence in that it will go on serenely increasing at a very sharp rate. Health has a ring fence of slight real terms growth, so less international development, but it's a much bigger budget. And then there are ring fences within departments, things like the cash freeze for science, the real terms increase in schools budgets. Now, if we look, so what we then need to start looking at some of those individual changes. First, welfare. Now, I think it's incredibly hard to discern an actual pattern in the welfare changes. Apart from the fact that it's the last hurrah for lots of little fiddles to welfare. It's up to 7 billion, so the changes to welfare are very significant. But it's hard to see a pattern. So you have child benefit changes, which would arguably hit single earner families hardest. You then have changes to the childcare, so the tax credit payments to childcare, which will arguably hit two earner families hardest. So you've got a lot of the patterns that we were starting to see emerging before the spending review have been obscured by the fact that the cuts are happening in a fashion which looks like it's the outcome of a political process, which is quite messy. And I don't think there really is any grand plan which you can find in the welfare cuts made at this stage. Hopefully, with greater welfare reform further down the line, we'll start to get a more coherent welfare policy. So I think at the moment the changes are just deeply erratic, as much as anything. I think the main objective has been to avoid any particularly hard cases, any particularly desperate, any particularly hard hits on the budgets of people on particularly low incomes, which is reasonable. I don't think there's any beyond that. There's any pattern we can see. So moving on from welfare, Mike's right to say that changed, and I think that affects the wealth thing also affects the employment figures. I would have thought that the June OBR statement, which is based on spending cuts, the reallocation of those cuts towards AME, towards handing money out, away from departmental spending, will actually mean that public sector job cuts figure is likely to be revised down, because you're moving away from the spending which is most associated with public sector employment. So ironically, I think the big headline has been about all these job cuts. If anything, with changes announced today, as opposed to what was announced in the emergency budget, we're moving in the other direction. But now moving on to spending, so we can shift on. Education. Now what we've tried to do is we've tried to put together and there are a lot more of these in the briefing document, which hopefully you're all getting. The PESA the figures in the public expenditure statistical analyses, with the figures announced yesterday, to get a longer-term picture of what's happened in spending. Now, the one caution to put on these figures is a big jump to 06-07. That's an artifact in the data. That's a dedicated schools grant, which meant that a big amount of budget was shifted from local governments to education. But we still can take a useful lesson from this graph. What it shows us is that education spending is coming down roughly to the level it was at. It will still be higher at the end of this spending review than it was in 06-07 in real terms, because all these are in real terms. So spending, again, it's quite similar to what's happening on the spending as a share of GDP figure. You're coming back to roughly where we were in 06-07.
Is there any sense of the per pupil? Because I know obviously there's been this sort of mini baby boom with a lot more kids coming through.
So you will have some pressure on it from per pupil. On the other hand, you do have some areas, I think this is a critical one, where some of the changes that we made would allow you to cut back, particularly on things like non-frontline staff, and also on the council education departments, which are included within here, which would, I think, be a potent area for savings if you're moving away from council management of schools. So I think there are ways of accounting for that. I think that that pressure doesn't look, it wants that cut, and I think that that's actually a much better reason to have hope that this pressure won't be huge on schools than this idea that schools' budgets protects it. I think that's a bit artificial. I think in reality, you can decide, it's like what is a frontline worker in the NHS, and it can include all sorts of things. I think what that school's budget is could cover a number of sins, and I don't actually think it's necessarily particularly meaningful that they've ring-fenced that within the education budget, because, well, what support for schools is being cut is the question, you know. What's coming out of the education budget? It's not like any of it's universities, that's moved off to another budget category now. So that's education. And there are other departments like that. And there are other areas which are getting much steeper cuts. Transport, we know there are going to be sharper cuts. There's some of the details of that in the briefing. We don't know some of the important questions, though. We don't know what's happening to high-speed rail. And the critical question, as far as we're concerned, is, are projects like high-speed rail going to be prioritised at the expense of roads? Because roads move far more people in absolute terms. They also move far more people far further per pound of subsidy of spending. So in terms of addressing congestion, the critical area is roads. Now, if roads are going to be sacrificed in order to make high-speed rail work, then I think there's a real question about particularly given, I think, some of the very dubious justification of high-speed rail, whether we're going to see decisions made which will lead to a lot more congestion in the years to come. DCLG, there are quite sharp cuts. I think that there's also this new flexibility for financing. I think what it will mean really is, if you think you have a good council, then the news won't be so bad. If you think you have a bad council, the news is extremely bad, because their budget's being cut and they've got more freedom to spend it badly. I think the hope is that you'll have an incentive for councils, and you'll have a proper accountability, and councils work better over time. So I think it's a good idea in the long term. In the short term, there might be a few people thinking, oh my God, the council haven't got more money, they've got more license to waste it. So I think that it's that long-term pressure we have to be looking to drive up council performance. And then there's the business innovation and skills, where there are quite sharp cuts. The regional development agencies are gone. Local enterprise partnerships could be even worse. We've started to see some of the appeals to get businesses involved with them, and they're all phrased in terms of, this is how we get our hands on grants. There's no justification of them in terms of, we will actually help, when they're actually talking to businesses, in terms of we will help coordinate useful economic cooperation across different businesses. It's all about, we will help you grab grants. And frankly, it's just this spending taxpayers' money to chase taxpayers' money game, which was one of the biggest problems with the regional development agencies.